Good evening. This is a text message from my cousin that she sent to me on WhatsApp on October 6, 2022, shortly, several days after the Iran security forces invaded Sharif University and beat up and arrested many students at Iran's most elite university for their participation in protests. Yes, I'm looking forward to hear some good news. Professors of Sharif University are going to have a gathering at the university to condemn what was done to their students. Everyone has plans to go out, step by step. We've tried every possible other way. We tried voting, even when there were very few acceptable candidates. The next time, they let even fewer people be nominated. We've tried reforms. Corruption is a huge barrier to achieve any results. We've tried dialogues. They don't listen. They think that this country is theirs. They have imprisoned us. This land belongs to the people who live in it. Please know I will be deleting all the messages I send to you. And luckily, I took a screenshot of that. This is a poem by a very important Iranian poet, Simin Behbahani, who died in, I think, 2011. And she wrote this poem in 2009 as she was heading out of the country shortly after the elections in Iran, and she was stopped before she could board the plane. And she was arrested and detained because she was a critic of Iran's policies towards women. It's called "Stop Throwing My Country to the Wind." If the flames of anger rise any higher in this land, your name on your tombstone will be covered with dirt. You have become a babbling loudmouth, your insolent ranting, something to joke about. The lies you have found, you have woven together. The rope you have crafted, you'll find around your neck. Pride has swollen your head. Your faith has grown blind. The elephant that falls will not rise. Stop this extravagance, this reckless throwing of my country to the wind. The grim-faced rising cloud will grovel at the swamp's feet. Stop this screaming, mayhem, and bloodshed. Stop doing what makes God's creatures mourn with tears. My curses will not be upon you as in their fulfillment. My enemies' afflictions also cause me pain. You may wish to have me burned or decide to stone me, but in your hand, match or stone will lose their power to harm me. This is a poem I wrote shortly after the protests erupted. Many people referred to the women who were filling the streets of Tehran as lion women, their bravery unmatched by anything we have seen in Iran. For my sisters in Iran, they're coming now, the Shirzan, lion women whose tiger tongues break loose in the chorus of autumn night. Their manes blow free in the air after the long darkness belted under the tent of the timid animal, men in robes and white turbans hiding in the barricade of a book, their guns masquerading as morality. They know nothing of this fierceness, of their refusal to be prisoners in the basement of their dreams. They cannot quiet this storm of shapeshifters whose bodies and minds have stored the ancient hunger to be free. They will rise and fly. They will be sated. Woman, life, freedom.
For that very moving poem, and I am biased because Persis is a hero of mine. Her book, A World Between, which is this incredible compilation of essays released, I think when I was in high school, like 25 years ago, around then, was absolutely life-changing. So I highly recommend that. Chris, should I use the mic or is this okay? Okay, perfect. So Okay, great. So hello, everyone, and welcome to this evening's World Affairs program. My name is Lily Dramali, and I'm a senior reporter at American Public Media's Marketplace. As you know, World Affairs is a San Francisco-based nonprofit and nonpartisan forum that explores international issues and ideas beyond borders in all their nuance and complexity. And I would say certainly this issue deserves nuance and complexity. We hope you enjoyed the viewing art, viewing the art in the lounge right out that way that's been loaned to us by Refugee Eye. That's a local gallery right here in San Francisco in the Mission District. But if you haven't had a chance, make sure you enjoy that artwork when we head back into the lounge for dinner. I'm excited to be here with Yegane Jun and be part of this first Salon experience here at World Affairs. This is an immersive and nuanced evening of art, dialogue, and food, and a chance to make personal connections. And I really want to stress that. Make sure you talk to each other. Make sure you get to know each other while you're here, because we want to discover together as part of this wonderful community that's here tonight. With me on stage is Yegane Rezaian. She is an Iranian journalist fighting for press freedom with the Committee to Protect Journalists. She goes by Yegi. Yegi Jun, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.
She came a long way to be here, 3,000 miles. And I feel like I should preface this by saying I think I have interviewed more members of your family than any other family in about 20 years of being a journalist. So over a year ago, I was on this very stage with Yegane's husband, Jason Rezaian, your brother-in-law, your mother-in-law beamed in by video. You are number 4.
Oh my God.
And when your little one is ready.
I hope we are the last. I'm the last.
Well, I was
no
gonna
more Rezaians get in trouble.
I was going to say, when your little one is ready, please send him my way. I'll interview him too, happily. So first of all, welcome to World Affairs.
Thank you so very much. Thank you for hosting us and doing the moderation this afternoon. And thank you to the World Affairs Council San Francisco for bringing such distinct group of Iranian Persian women together. I think it's very special that all speakers tonight are women. So let's do this.
Let's do this. And I wanted to begin with your personal story. And as a journalist, I love asking questions about why people decided to become journalists. But your story is really unique and very special. You started as a journalist in Iran, a place where doing that kind of work comes with obvious risks. And by the end, you were working for Western outlets. Bloomberg was the last outlet, I believe, that you worked for. So why did you decide to take on this career, especially in such a risky environment, to do this work?
So let me start by saying that I was born and raised in Iran in the era of post-79 revolution. And I had a very typical childhood for a girl born and raised in a country called Islamic Republic of Iran. And very early on, I learned that there are 2 realities in my country. There's the reality that me and my family live behind closed door inside our home, and there's the other reality that is forced on us with possibly values that were not necessarily practiced or accepted by my family, by the government and the system. And as you can imagine, it's hard for anyone to navigate such a lifestyle, but particularly for women in places like my home country or my homeland. So I was always interested in learning the Western culture. I was very interested in learning the English language. In fact, I studied English literature in college, and then I got my master's in English. And I always dreamed about traveling outside the country and particularly America, because I think one thing Islamic Republic government did really well with their propaganda was awakening our curiosity. The generation of Iranian born after the revolution suddenly became very curious about, like, what is America? Why is it our greatest enemy? Or things like that. Or the same about Israel, right? Because they were constantly throwing these propagandas against America, United States, Israel, Britain, or Western world and Western culture on us, and producing content on TV and other cultural productions. And I think it backlashed on them.
So
as you can see.
as somebody growing up in Iran,
Yes,
you're saying the youth did not take this as at face value.
Yes,
those messaging,
exactly.
Those messages.
And so that's how I became interested in learning the language and wanted to travel outside and come to United States. And I remember when I was 9 years old, I told my mom that I'm gonna marry an American. And yes, I did. I married the first one I met, and he happens to be a very good one, the best for me. And meeting my husband, who was a journalist at the time, also, I think all of a sudden opened so many doors for me, in the sense that I realized every other coverage of my country that I have seen throughout the years, by having access to satellite dishes. So we grew up watching CNN or BBC to some extent. Everything is focused on the regime and the government and the hard news and the nuclear negotiations, or Iran's nuclear power, or every other journalist who traveled to Iran were trying to get an interview with whoever that was then's Iranian president, right? But where is the role of Iranian people? And I think that made me think about, I want to become a journalist and talk about my people and my country rather than the Islamic Republic. I want to show who we are and what we like and what are our hopes and dreams and aspirations to American audience particularly.
Yeah.
So I
think a lot of us relate to that. A lot of Iranian
Yes.
journalists, people in the diaspora who are doing this work, relate to that desire to want to see a more multidimensional impression, message about Iran and the people of Iran.
Yes.
And I want to ask, so Jason is your husband, American husband is Jason Rezaian, who was a journalist for the Washington Post, a reporter, one of the few in Iran, and is now a columnist there.
There, you mean not Iran, right?
At the Washington Post. So what was it like working as a journalist before you and Jason, as many in the audience are probably well aware, were detained? So you were detained and arrested. Forgive me. You were in detention for about 72 days, I believe. Jason has written extensively about his detention for 544 days. What was it like before that working? What was the operating environment like?
Yes, I started practicing journalism, as I say, by love, by falling in love with Jason and following his path. So as Iranian's Revolutionary Guards would put it, he trained me really well, although they meant in the espionage field, like being in spy, which is absolute nonsense. I worked with several other American journalists who were visiting journalists at the time as a freelancer, as a fixer, as a translator. And then I started writing my own pieces. And as you can imagine, journalism is a very interesting work, right? It never disappoints. And it's very exciting and takes you to so many unexpected journeys like ours. But in a country like Iran that is ruled by a theocracy and it's an authoritarian regime, and particularly the misogyny and patriarchy is very engraved in the system. Becoming a woman journalist is not easy. And in my case, it was a little bit, I guess, more complicated because the authorities would see me as a local girl, right? So I'm Iranian, born and raised. I speak the language, but I also write in English for foreign media, for an American media. So they were a little bit confused about what I was.
What do they do with you?
So I remember they had an easier time communicating with me, but at the same time, there were always this question that if you are Iranian and if you love your country, which I obviously do very much love my country, but by that they meant the regime, why do you write for an American media? So I always had to answer this question many, many times and basically trying to prove that I'm not a spy. And again, being a woman was very complicated in the sense that I was a local woman, so these very misogynist men in the system who are in a position of power will sometimes, as you can imagine, will let themselves to take advantage of their position and their situation. So navigating around, I remember I told you, Lily, June, that when I went to the Vezarat Ershad, which is the Ministry of Islamic Guidance and Culture, which is in charge of issuing press credentials for journalists, and they told me that after 9 months, it took them 9 months to approve of me going and doing all kinds of background check and all of those. And once they gave me the credential, they said, by the way, there are so many red lines and so many boundaries that you have to make sure you follow. And I said, okay, great. So where's the handbook? Do you have a piece of paper that tells me, for example, red line number 1, don't write about this topic, for example. Red line number 2, don't go to this place. And they said, no, these red lines are always changing and they're always blurry. So you have to learn them by practicing. If we ever call you and say, come in, then you know you crossed one of those red lines.
I was fascinated when you told me that story, and I think we want to underscore with this anecdote that all media in Iran is state-run, right?
Yes, this is a point that most people in the Western world who live in democracies don't know. There is not such a thing as an independent media in Iran. All media is state-run, means funded and subsidized by the government, which is the greatest tool for the regime to have full autonomy and control over whatever that gets published or written or produced, whether it's for print or TV or radio. And these days that includes social media as well, like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So there's not such a thing as an independent media. And it's also good to mention that all journalists in Iran, whether local or foreigners working for local media or again, foreign media, whatever the language, they also have to register with the government and wait for that background check and then receive press credentials. Yeah. You can't just fly and land and say, okay, I'm gonna go make this documentary. No, you need to have lots of, you have to go to so many offices, meet so many of these unpleasant officials and sign so many forms that sometimes you are not sure what they are really asking you.
And as somebody who works in public media, I want to say, Elon Musk, if you're listening, that's what is meant by state media. So I'll just put that out there. Okay, so Almost a decade ago, you appeared on you met with Anthony Bourdain,
Yes.
I should say, and the episode came out quite a ways after that. But you were on his show, you sat down with him for Parts Unknown. And you've written about that episode, and I just wanted to read something that you shared. You said that the Iran episode of Parts Unknown did more than any foreign television production ever has to show my homeland in all of its complexities, for better and for worse. It gave a voice to my country in a way no American production had before. Can you talk about why that portrayal was so meaningful to you?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, it was a great experience and honor to meet with him. Such a great guy. God bless his soul. Referring to the previous point about how most coverage of my homeland in the Western media was focused on what the regime does and the politics and the hard news, oil, gas, foreign currency, again, nuclear negotiations in Geneva or United Nations. No other, particularly American TV, came to Iran to portray Iranian people, to give voice to Iranian people. I remember our own, I like to say that, our own, we Iranians or Persians claim her as their own. Legendary Christiana Amanpour always interviewed Iranian officials, whether if she was able to come to the country back then or every time the Iranian officials came to the States. But again, the voice of Iranian people was missing from the coverage. And he came, and as I wrote, showed Iran as it was. He did not necessarily make it a glory or a disappointment. He showed it exactly as it was, with its good and bad, and told the story of people and politics through a very humanizing topic, which is food. And it was really beautiful to see that he gave voice to women on his show, young men. He traveled to different cities. And I remember sitting with him having a meal in this beautiful location in northern Tehran, in Darband. And we constantly only talked about politics, and I was waiting for him to ask a question about the food we were eating. and I said, "Do you have any question about this fish or this kebab?" And he said, "No, but I want to know why Iranian women are so educated, or why Iranian women are protesting wearing the hijab, while we never in the American media hear about Saudi women protesting wearing the veil." And that just blew my mind, that this guy is not just focused on the stew. It is important for him to get to know us as who we are. And he's willing to show us to his audience exactly.
With nuance. Which I think we keep coming back to that word, right?
And
complexity.
I hope you all watched that episode, but if you haven't, and if you did, again, go back. That music is what we grew up with. The streets exactly as they are, how people are so warm and hospitable, and good food and simple, and how my fellow Iranian men and women share the same dreams and aspirations and hopes, and dream about a good quality of life and like economic prosperity for their children. Anything that any family anywhere else would want to have, like a good quality of life. So I think he did an amazing job, and we were hoping that he comes back, which didn't happen, unfortunately. It will never happen again. But it was also a very special time because it was right after the election of President Rouhani at the time, who was more known as a more moderate figure within that Islamic Republic system, and the nuclear negotiations were beginning to go on with world powers. So people were also very hopeful about an opening in the country, more Western media, more visitors, more travel, again, economic prosperity, because for years people have dealt with economic problems and sanctions. And I remember he asked me particularly, because obviously Jason and I were on different life paths. He grew up here in Bay Area. What is better than that, right? What an amazing
A Marin
childhood.
boy.
Yeah, a Marin boy in a ranch, imagine. But for me, as a woman born and raised in a dark gray city of Tehran that is just hustle and bustle and loud and smoke and pollution and wearing hijab. And he asked me, are you hopeful? And I said, yes, I'm absolutely very hopeful, because I was.
Yeah.
Not knowing that we would sit in jail 5 weeks later.
That's right. That's right. Well, I want to talk to you about the media coverage of this moment in Iran.
Yes.
We've talked about what it was like in the run-up to this moment. But first, your thoughts on how Western media in particular, when it does actually cover the protests in Iran, what do you make of that?
So, very good point. First, I think Western media is not doing justice in covering the news of Iran, particularly the protests. If you go back about 2 years, you see there's been many coverage of Taliban taking over Afghanistan and the Ukraine war. Where's Iran? Where's the story of Iran? And if you go back and check most of the coverage of this women life freedom movement in the past few months that was done in the American media is done behind the scene mostly in channels that there is like an Iranian descent producer or reporter or something like that. Otherwise, American people, unfortunately, they did not pay enough attention, or the news media didn't care. There are several reasons for it. First, I think the major reason is that Iran is equal to Islamic Republic. So because Americans or America or the news is frustrated with the regime and does not like the regime, so it doesn't matter if they cover the news of that land particularly or give voice to its people. Unfortunately, the people and the regime have been put together in one box, which is wrong. Second, to me, it's very obvious part of it has been done for the past 40 years in the hands of the regime. At this point, Lily June, there's less than handful of Western media based in Iran.
I think that's such an important point.
Yes.
I mean, in fairness, it is very hard as a Western journalist to get into Iran and do this work in Iran. And so I want to ask you, I mean, who is doing that work?
And this was planned by the regime for a very long time. They were determined to diminish the foreign media. When Jason and I were covering Iran inside the country, he was the Washington Post and I was the Bloomberg News. And we were like half of foreign media. Since then, Washington Post is out. New York Times, out. AP has an office, all local reporters. And on the condition of regime choosing these reporters. Reuters, the office has been shut down for over 10 years. AFP has an office, Agence France Presse, but again, mostly local reporter except for the bureau chief. So this was planned by the regime. This was in the work for a very long time. They wanted to kick foreign media out in order to make sure, especially after the bloody re-election of President Ahmadinejad in 2009, they decided to, little by little, kick foreign media out to make sure if there are unrests, if there are protests, if there's dissatisfaction of the regime, there's no one to give voice to that. There's no one to show that. That's why Iran has turned into this black hole, and that's why I remember in October I did an interview with Christiane Amanpour, and I said, right now it is so difficult to get any information from Iran. It is an absolute black hole. We don't know what is happening in the streets of Tehran unless for very brave people who are willing to risk, and they have a hard time because the internet was shut down too.
Right.
So
Can I just jump in for 1
Sure.
second? I just want to let folks know that you will have an opportunity to ask Yegi questions later in the program. So there's just so many interesting threads that I want to follow here, and you can all jump in as well. But I do want to get to your work with CPJ, the Committee to Protect Journalists. And I wanted to begin by just asking you, one of the things CPJ has been so diligent about is tracking the number of journalists in Iran detained since this uprising began a few months ago. Talk about where things stand on that front.
Sure. At the Committee to Protect Journalists, we regularly document the number of attacks on the press globally, and we are, as you said, a nonpartisan, impartial, non-political organization. The headquarters is based in New York, but we have stringers and representatives all over the world. And when the protests started happening here in Iran, we immediately mobilized, because experience shows us every time there is a boiling pot in one particular country, then that's where our works gets crazy and at times very overwhelming. In less than 4 months, since late September, the Committee to Protect Journalists documented over 100 arrests of journalists in Iran. And I want to emphasize that this by no means is a correct tally of the number of journalists arrested. The correct tally must be much higher. But for all the reasons we talked earlier, it is very hard to get information. There are people who are scared. They don't want to share the story of their loved ones who are detained. There are reporters in smaller cities that maybe their internet was shut down or caught, or are afraid to report again about being detained, arrested, or they are from such local small medias that even government doesn't care about them as like naming them or listing them in their own database. So it's very hard to track, but we did do our best. 100 arrests.
And you also have a lot of people now in exile.
Yes.
Which is, if people are looking to help, by the way, this is a really important way, is contributing to CPJ, because you are supporting those people who are in exile, who were trying to do this work and had to leave.
Yes. So half of those journalists, I want to make sure I mention this time around, were women. And this is not the first time. And Iran in 2022, based on our annual census, became the biggest jailers of journalists and biggest jailer of women journalists, unfortunately, next to Russia and China and Turkey and Egypt. And Iran has fallen on that category of biggest jailers of journalists regularly in the past decade or so. So this is not by any means a new phenomenon. But it went crazy this time during these protests. And one thing that experience has taught us at the Committee to Protect Journalists is that every time there's a conflict zone, then we immediately deal with the wave of immigration, and journalists fleeing the country for different reasons, those who have been detained and arrested and now come out and they are dealing with pressure and mental health, or they were physically tortured, or in many cases, one of the sentences that Islamic Republic is giving these journalists is banned from doing journalism for X number of years. And imagine if you're trained as a journalist, what do? I have talked to people who proudly say, I'm painting a building, but I'm a writer. I'm a journalist, and I have been banned from doing what I know how to do best and what I love to do. But because I have been banned, I am now like painting a building.
Yeah.
And so for so many reasons like this, people start immigrating. And as you can imagine, immigration is by itself a very hard, long process, especially if you are undocumented, especially if Islamic Republic confiscated your passport, then you have to cross the country, cross the border illegally. So CPJ has done a very good job of supporting many of these journalists in exile, and that's a very tangible cause, as you said, for Americans or Iranians in diaspora to help and contribute and support. Often I heard from folks during this round of protests saying, how can we help? How can we support? Every single dollar or cent saves a day in a life of a journalist. And these are very, very tangible, real stories. We helped financially, so we offer financial assistance, we offer medical assistance, whether it's for their physical or their mental health. We help with facilitating humanitarian visas for some of these journalists to get into a safe place. And I once talked to a journalist who said, I crossed the border from northern Iran to Turkey by foot with only $125 in my pocket.
Incredible. That is truly incredible. As a journalist, I want to thank you for the work that you're doing and for the work that CPJ is doing. And one theme I hope we return to, but something that you said that struck me during our chats before this event, was just this idea that in this moment, this is a woman-led uprising, and we're seeing the male journalists, I think you said that they were cognizant of this and that they are handing the microphone to these female journalists. And I want to return to that theme later in the program. Yegi, thank you so much for sharing your personal story and for your perspective. Up next, we have two dedicated and passionate Iranian women, Dr. Persis Karim, who you saw earlier, and Firuze Mahmoudi. But first, the ArtRise Collective, in collaboration with Mosaic Philanthropy, has curated a collection of visual arts created by various artists during the first 90 days of this women-led revolution in Iran, specific to the intersectional message of women, life, freedom. The public art projection exhibition seeks to make this art more broadly available to those seeking greater awareness of this historic moment. The screening is going to take about 7 minutes, and then we will return for more discussion. Thank you.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره‌ای که میخنده برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه، برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی. برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره‌ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه، برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی. برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره‌ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه، برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای حساب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای 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 آزادی.
I just want to thank World Affairs Council for tonight's program, but also to thank the Art Rise Collective that agreed to let us show this. 95% of the artists are based in Iran, and they submitted their work, most of them anonymously out of fear of being found out. And each of the artists was awarded a prize of $1,000 for agreeing to submit their work. So if you're interested in showing this, Mosaic Philanthropy is really interested in having people see this work. They're now doing a second call for submissions for the next phase of this uprising, which is very different. You saw a lot of hair cutting, and in Iran, the ritual of cutting your hair is connected to the idea of mourning and protest. So around the world, people were, of course, cutting their hair in solidarity with the women of Iran. And we're now in a very different phase, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And I don't even know if I introduced myself, but I'm Persis Karim. I'm a professor at San Francisco State, and I'm the director of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. And one of the things that strikes me all the time is that my role is not just to amplify the stories of Iranians, but also to amplify the stories of Iranians who live here, because in large part, they too are conflated with the Iranian government, and they often don't get to share their stories as Americans and as Iranians. And one of the great things about Iranians that you should know is that they're incredibly artistic people. They have a very long and rich artistic tradition. And I see my friend back there who's an artist. And one of the ways that they've been communicating is actually about the struggle in Iran is through art. And so when we're not able to see things in journalism, because I have to say, not only do we not have journalists on the ground, we have a kind of dumb media that doesn't want to look elsewhere and has been so fed the narrative about Iran through the rhetoric of our government that sometimes they aren't looking. But artists are doing an incredible work right now, as are human rights workers. And that brings me to introducing you to my friend Firuzeh Mahmoudi. She is the founder and executive director of United for Iran. After witnessing the 2009 uprising, which was in the aftermath of the fraudulent election of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, she organized a solidarity protest spanning 110 cities. And I remember it so clearly because we were all riveted to our cell phones in June of 2009, seeing live footage from protests in Iran. And it was another moment where people in this country were really proud and really inspired by the bravery of young people in Iran. And then Michael Jackson died, and that kind of hijacked the news circuit. So we are constantly struggling to get a message about Iran that is truthful and nuanced and also humane. in times when there aren't protests, but even especially now. So shortly after that episode of 2009, Firuzeh started United for Iran, based in Berkeley, and its mission is to advance human rights and social justice in Iran, to strengthen Iranian social movements, civil society, activists, people, and marginalized communities through technology, documentation, awareness raising, and capacity building. Previously, Firuzeh worked at the United Nations and at several NGO organizations supporting communities around the world with advocating for environmental justice and health. She earned her master's degree in public affairs from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at the University of Indiana, Bloomington. And she's worked tirelessly since 2009. And I can't tell you how proud I am of all the work she's done more recently to address the recent uprisings. And it takes a lot of stamina to work on Iran, I can tell you. So thank you, Firuzeh.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be here.
So I'm going to ask her to say a little bit about her earlier life, her formative years. One of the things that's really interesting about living in the Bay Area is there's a very wide range of people who've come from Iran as early as the 50s. My father came in 1946 and ended up in the Bay Area in the early 50s. Firuzeh is an example of somebody who came as a very young person, pre-adolescent, right? 12?
Cusp.
After the Iranian Revolution. And that's a critical age, I think, for trying to sort out who you are and the world you're living in. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how that might have influenced some of your decisions about starting this organization.
Thank you, Princess John. So good to be here on stage with you. So I was raised in Iran till age 12. I lived through the revolution. My mom is here. She was very active politically. Hi, Mom. And I was on the streets protesting at a very young age. I was a self-declared communist. I was very active as a kid. And so it was a very big part of who I was. And so the war started, and my sister and I were born in San Francisco, actually, and left when we were toddlers. So my dad came with 2 American passports and brought us back here. My mom could not leave, so I would go back and visit her. But being in Iran during the war and the revolution was obviously during formative years was a huge part of who I was. And I remember having a speech coach one time, and I used to say this thing that I accidentally started a nonprofit because I just organized this day and it blew up. I'm like, wow, okay, 110 cities, great. And then I'm like, okay, let's start this thing. Let's do this thing. And she's like, listening to your story is not that accidental, So that's kind of how it all started.
Yeah. And the 2009 protests, in some ways, I think, gave an awareness to the much longer arc of Iranian history. And I think to some degree, maybe for our audience, you could talk about the current protests as a connection to these earlier protest movements in Iran, 2009, 2019.
Right. So I would say what's different this time around. So we've had protests throughout the years in Iran, and the 2009 we thought that was it, and it wasn't. And this one we still don't know. But what's different about this one is the message is different. The country has been held hostage for 44 years now, and people are done. And the kind of chants and slogans people say are, we have more bodies than you have bullets. And I swear on the blood of my friend that I'm staying here till the end. And that our rage is more than your power. So these are chants that we did not hear before. People still believed that reform was possible, the Green Movement, and I don't think there are many people. And Iran has gotten worse and worse and worse over the years. And the group of people who want the Islamic Republic out has grown to essentially, I don't know the numbers, easily 80%. Their own cronies, people who've been indoctrinated by them through the Basijis and Revolutionary Guard, and their families are the only ones left. Economically, Iranians, dire straits, obviously human rights conditions, that was spoken to. Environmentally, Iran's absolute disaster. A lot of people want to get Iran back, so we have a shot in hell to save the country. We're running out of water. So this is kind of the context within which this new round of uprisings started.
And can you talk specifically about the spark, Mahsa Jina Amini's death, and how that sort of began the uprising, specifically the woman-led uprising?
Right. I'm sure you all have seen her pictures. It was here, and the story. Few things that I don't know if Western media has covered as much. So quickly, Mahsa and her family from the Kurdish region went to Tehran for a short visit. She had a few strands of her hair out, and the Revolutionary Guards took her in. She left custody unconscious with a blow to her head, and she died a few days later. And they had a funeral for her in her hometown. They started the chant Jan Jian Azadi, which is woman, life, freedom. So the chant that we hear is a Kurdish chant that the rest of the country has taken on. So that's really important. The origin of this story, the fact that the beauty of this story, as heartbreaking as it is, it was a young Kurdish woman and then the whole country's like, that's it, we've had enough. And it just spread everywhere. And there was a woman at her grave that took off her hijab. This is after Mahsa being killed for a few strands of hair showing, and she just took it off and burned it, and that spread as well. So that's what we have. And another part of the story that's both heartbreaking and heartwarming is her brother said, we were in Tehran and we had no one. And so many people tweeted back, you have a whole country. The whole country is your family. And that's how this started.
And many of the images that you saw, especially the images of young girls with the flowers in the box, those were all young women who were killed in the first few weeks of the protests, either killed directly or kidnapped and disappeared. And since September 16, 2022, about how many people have been arrested and detained and killed? Do you know?
It's hard to know the numbers, and that's by design. We know at least hundreds and hundreds have been reported killed, but I'm sure it's more, and over 10,000 have been arrested. Yeah.
Yes.
But the number's always lower, as it was mentioned by Yigijan. It's always lower. The numbers we get are lower, and it's hard to know.
So in those early days of the protest, the focus was on the hijab because it was an act of state violence that killed Mahsa Jina Amini because of her hijab. So we saw women ripping off their hijab. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, for audiences, I think it's really easy to think about the veil in a very specific way, but
Right.
This is much bigger than that. This is a struggle for women's bodily autonomy, which I also want to point out to all of you, is a struggle we're having right here in the United States of America. But how did it shift from a protest around the hijab, women burning their veils, to now something that's much bigger and much more widespread, both in its geographic and ethnic makeup?
Right. I think it's really important to kind of have the context and the history of why the hijab is such a big deal, both for the women, as you mentioned, and for the Islamic Republic. Why are they not just, okay, fine, take it off, we'll keep the rest, we'll keep the power? I think it goes to kind of the history of the Islamic Republic. We had, of course, this story of CIA and the coup of 1953 in Iran. So there's that as a backdrop. And we also have the Shah, who westernized Iran very quickly. And some people were not a big fan of that westernization. So when the Islamic Republic started and consolidated power and stole the revolution, essentially, they promised a very specific ideology, that we will take Iran back to traditional Islamic family values. And that was how they took the country. Everyone's like, okay, it was kind of that's what happened. So the very first protest against the hijab was in 1979 on March 8th, International Women's Day. And the women went to the streets and they're like, no. And there were the bellwethers. They're like, if this regime is willing and is able to visibly in front of the whole country oppress half of its citizens, it's over. They'll do this to all of us, and we have to put an end to it now. And we know a lot more about intersectionality, not that it's always used, but people have said, well, we have a bigger issue now, we'll deal with this later. So now, the daughters and the granddaughters of those women in the streets are like, absolutely not. It's our turn. We want our body autonomy, like you said, and we've had enough. We want to be who we want to be. I have cousins in Iran whose body have not seen the sun. It's not a small thing. Of course, there's so many other things. And the same way that the water fountain is not about water, this is just a symbol of their power, and it's the hijab is so much more than that. And for the Islamic Republic on the other side, they have nothing going for them short of their corruption and their consolidated power. They're not doing well. They're mismanaging the entire country top to bottom. So the only thing they have left is ideology. So if they give up this, there's nothing left to them. And that's why they're holding on to it so strongly.
Can you talk a little bit about how the movement has changed from September to now, 7 months later, both in terms of who's engaged, what does it look like? We almost don't hear very much anymore. And yesterday I was on KQED and they asked me, is the movement over? No, it's not over. It's in a new phase, and people have to be clever about how to go about it. And certainly not having social media, the internet, and the censorship and detention of journalists is part of it. So what are some of the ways that people are responding now versus at the beginning?
Right, it's a really good question. Maybe I'll give a little context of the whole movement and why it's unique, and then finish with that, if that's okay. So this time is different. It's been lasting now for 6+ months, and this is the first time we've had this in Iran, an uprising that has lasted this time, so that's singular. It's really diverse and intersectional. All the groups I mentioned are involved, so it's geographically diverse and has been throughout. Socioeconomically, because everyone's starving. People are selling gold, selling kidneys to put food on the table. It is, queer folks are on the streets, although they can get killed for it. We have a database of all the political prisoners in Iran. We never put queer activists because you just can't do that, right? So it's incredibly diverse. You have youth, you have all the different generations, obviously the women, and marginalized populations. If we win this time, it's because of the Baluch and the Kurds. They are still in the streets in a massive way. Every Friday, the Baluch are a sea of people, and the Kurdish region as well. And those are the regions that the government does internet shutdown more than any other place. And then the number of people being killed in these areas is incredibly disproportionate to the rest of the country, there are few. So that's one thing. And people are also extremely fearless this time. I think violence and power works when people are scared. If you're not scared of being killed, or you're willing to put your life on the line, that takes away the government's power, and we've seen that. So we've seen people being executed by the regime, young boys, young men in their 20s, early 20s and teens. The government has shot at the genitals and the breast of women. This is what we're dealing with, and they're shooting young folks on the streets in the eye. And what they're saying is, like, one of the women who was shot in the eye, one eye, and is blind one eye, said that, through my one eye, I see a better future. This is how people are showing up. And they're showing up, people are being killed, and then you look at their Instagram, last Instagram post, and they're saying, if I die, it's okay, you guys keep going, we got this. So that's kind of the message. And that has continued. And another piece that's important to point out is it's a leaderless movement inside the country. but it's incredibly well orchestrated. It's like flights of birds that move together and they don't hit each other, and it's like almost like one organism. It's like that. Something happens in one part of the country, another part responds. They put a family whose kid has been executed on house arrest. Everybody else starts marching to the prison, to the cemetery to be at the grave of that person. So many stories like this throughout the country. A young girl's like, and it's incredible to see because we all are witnessing it. Everyone's tracking because of social media. We all see it, right? So there's a young girl who's like clenching her fist with dirt on top of her, next to her mother's grave. And the next day, this famous soccer player showed up to her house just to cheer her up. So we're seeing all these things as different components of this uprising. And I would say how it's changed. It's kind of like the charcoal that's under the ash. It's very much there. If you pay attention, it's there. We still see pockets of it. We still see, in particular, women not wearing the hijab throughout the country. That's still happening. And small acts of defiance that, if you don't know Iran, may not seem like a big deal, that you're like, wow, okay, this happened. Like a famous actress taking her hijab off and being on camera, and for the first person, her career may be over. She may be in prison for many, many years. They're still doing things like this. Or an athlete, same thing. So we're seeing this, the hijabs coming off. We're seeing the protests in the ethnic minority regions. We're seeing like I said, the small acts. And we're also seeing the government pushing back still. So the youth on the streets are, and in their schools are chanting. Like they're like elementary school and middle school and high school kids. And they're like taking their hijab off, and they're showing off the government official in their school. Every institution in Iran has a government official that's connected to the government, not the academic. So they're showing them off. They're ripping the pictures of the supreme leader, old and new. And to address this, they're poisoning them. They're poisoning them with gas. And there are thousands now of kids who've been poisoned. A couple have died, and hundreds of schools, mostly
Primarily girls' schools.
almost all, like
Yeah.
there are a couple exceptions, and then there's the protests around that, of course, as well. But that's kind of where it's at right now.
And it's really important to understand that women's literacy, girls and women's literacy, changed dramatically after 1979 because the government, because of segregated schools and because they forced women to wear the hijab, there are more girls who've been educated in the last 44 years. And what happens when you educate girls? They get uppity and they expect things from their government. And I think one of the sort of alarming things about this gassing girls in schools is that, first of all, it probably is freaking out parents. And second of all, it's a direct attack on women's education, which it's only one step below what the Taliban has done, which is to actually close down schools and forbid girls from going. It's to make people afraid.
Absolutely.
And it's not really working, is it?
No.
Yeah. I would like you to talk in the little bit of time we have remaining a little bit about some of the work that United for Iran is doing, because I think you're deploying very interesting strategies to stay connected to people in Iran, to use technology to help build sort of awareness about the ways in which people can fight back. So could you say a little
Absolutely. There's a couple little footage, videos I want to show around the youth. Should I talk about Iran first or that first? Do you have a preference?
No, you go for it. Whatever.
Okay. All right. Maybe I'll do that first, and then we'll kind of transition to us. So I want to quickly talk about the youth in Iran and why it's so critical. First of all, they're looking at the older generation, their cousins, their peers, their siblings, and seeing what future they did not have and how it's getting worse for them, and they're putting their lives on the line. And what I see in them that I think is beautiful is that they have been able to bring the Islamic Republic to their knees more than anyone else. And anyone who's around teenagers knows that, they're scary. They're scary bunch. My son and niece are here. And that's on a regular day. Now imagine you have they have nothing to lose, and they're in the right, and they're wise beyond their years, because when you live under really hard conditions, that's unfortunately what happens. So we're seeing this very young generation that I'm like, I want to know what to do with them. What the hell are they going to do with it? So I have a couple of short videos to show. And one thing that the youth bring in that I think is so critical during uprisings like this is humor. You have to continue, you have to sustain, and celebration. So I'll talk about that in a little bit. So while you're doing that, I'll mention, her name is Sarina. She was 16 years old when she was killed. And she is brilliant. Everyone fell in love with her. And the fact that she's not in our world anymore, but it's just absolutely heartbreaking.
My lover's got humor. He's the giggle at a funeral. Knows everybody's disapproval. I should.
یه نوجوانه 16 ساله چی نیاز داره؟ به محبت کردن، محبت دیدن، دوست داشته شدن و دوست داشتن نیاز داره. ما نیازمند شادی، تفریح، نیازمند یه روحیه خوب، یه وایب خوب، یه انرژی خوب. همه اینا نیازمند چی هست؟ آزادی. اینجا بحثمون یکم دارک میشه. چرا؟ چون یه سری محدودیت هایی که مخصوصا واسه زنها خیلی بیشتر، مثل حجاب اجباری یا خیلی خیلی ممنوعیت هایی که واسه پسرها نیست. مثلا ما حتی یه استودیو نمیتونیم بریم. اینا همه ما مواجه شدیم، درد سراشو تک تک چشیدیم. شاید تو بیشتر، من کمتر، یا من بیشتر، تو کمتر، اما هممون میدونیم که ایران چه وضعیتی داره الان. مردم یک کشور چه انتظاری میتونن داشته باشن از کشور خودشون؟ رفاه، رفاه، رفاه. نه چیز دیگه. خب وضعیت اقتصادیمون که داغونه، فرهنگیمون داغونه، اصالتمون داغونه.
Take me to church, I worship like a dog at the shrine of your light. Tell you my sins and you can sharpen your knife. Offer me that death instead. Good God, let me give you my life. Take me.
دیگه این الان 20 سال پیش نیستش که ما جز نوجوانای همسن خودمون تو ایران هیچ کس دیگه ایران ندیده باشیم. نه، ما اون کسی که تو اتیوپی داره از گرسنگی میمیره رو دیدیم. اونی هم که داره تو اله عشق خودش هم میکنه رو دیدیم. و خب اونجایی هم که انسان کمالگراست همیشه به اون خوبه نگاه کنه و میخواد بشه اون خوبه.
آزادی is looting. چه حسی بهتر از این حس که رها و آزاد
So as you put on the next one, it's cartoonish almost. It's like fiction, fact is greater than fiction. If some animator wanted to make a movie about this, and that's, I think someone should, and kind of drew this out, people would say that's a little too much. You have these old, decrepit, evil men and these vibrant young souls. This is who's fighting in our country. 16-year-olds like her. Next video. Pause it for 1 second so I can, thank you so much. So this is where the humor comes in. So the youth are doing this thing called turban tossing. So they're going behind the mullahs and they're quietly sneaking behind them and tossing their turbans, and then they're playing it to Curb Youth Enthusiasm soundtrack. And a couple of them got arrested, but they keep doing it. And the beauty of it, the poetic justice of the women were forced to wear hijab, and they're taking the fabric off these mullahs' head. And some of them are like not wearing it or putting a scarf around it. So it's kind of nice to have these light moments during the uprising as well.
Salon. شاسی بلنده ماشینش به به زن زندگی آزادی مرگ بر دیکتاتور
آخون برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو
And the last video is 40 seconds. It's kind of shows a celebration. There's so many different ways that art is being used in Iran, as Persis John mentioned. And for me, the celebration is so critical too, because we have to stay in a state of positivity in order to continue. We also they're winning everything else. We cannot let them win how we feel inside our bodies. And that's a form of survival, I think, as well.
Another banger, baby, calm down, calm down. Yo, this your body, it puts in my heart for lockdown, oh lockdown. Yo, you sweet life, phantom, phantom. If I tell you say I love you, you know they for me, young girl, oh young girl. No, tell me no, 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 oh, 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 oh. Baby, gon' give me your lo, 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 oh, 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 oh. You got me like whoa, 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 whoa.
So they're trying to control these people and put a scarf on their heads, and this is what they're dealing with. So they very much have their backs to the wall in many ways.
Can you talk a little bit about
absolutely.
United for Iran?
I would love to talk about United for Iran. So our work is to support the movement inside Iran. We believe that true change will come from inside the country, and supporting and building the capacity and supporting any which way we can. That's critical, and improving human rights. And we have a wide range of projects. I'll mention a few of them. We run a database of all the political prisoners in Iran. That includes judges. It includes prisons as well. So we can advocate for each individual, but also look at patterns of abuse and systematic oppression as well, and hold the culprits accountable. And in order to do that job well, we have to work with a wide range of folks from different ethnic minority backgrounds, because each area has their own network, and then we can get information from all the different parts of the country. So, and that project is used by the UN, by various governments, by the families inside Iran, by journalists, by researchers. And we also started a project, we finished the second round recently, called Iran Incubator. It's an incubator through which we help community members further scale and sustain their work. If a tech tool is needed, it's not always needed. So it could be on a wide range of things. I like to say that our work is either doing what the government should be doing or stopping the government from what they should not be doing. So that's a range of it. So it can be on harm reduction issues, it can be on domestic violence, on sexual health, more political issues as well. One of our apps that, it's always the sexiest. Everyone's like, oh, wow, tell me more. We started in 2016. It's called Gershad. It's similar to Waze, if you know it. The users can locate and detour the location of the morality police. And that guy right there is his idea. Reza. So we started it, immediately went viral, this many generations later, and obviously a huge issue. To be seen. And during the uprisings, folks started using it, the users started using it for the security forces as well. So we have a new button for that. And now they're using the traffic cameras to take pictures of folks in cars who don't have a hijab on, so they can then, like the way we get tickets if you're on a red. So that is going to be added to the app as well. So that's another project. And maybe two quick other things. We synthesize all this information through the database, working with all our partners, and we kind of do threat mapping on tactics and operations used by operational and security tactics used by the Islamic Republic. And then we share that information inside the country through toolkits, through videos, everyone's on Instagram. So we do it through all the different ways. And it's to reduce the cost and chance of arrest. And it's a psychological warfare. So knowing what to expect, it's like they'll lie and say, your mother just had a heart attack. tell us the information so you can get out. If you know that they do that all the time, well, you have a very different reaction. Or if you're in solitary confinement and you have certain thoughts and you know that's typical, then it's much easier. So it's kind of to support that. And generally supporting the movement, the marginalized populations, in particular inside Iran, any which way we can. And as folks, of course, leave the country, we provide support too, informally. Yeah.
So I want to encourage people. Over here, we struggle to figure out ways to support the people of Iran. This is one organization. I think Yegi's organization is another. There are various human rights organizations that are documenting. They're doing the work of journalists, which is to document the people who've been detained. So if you want to support either of these two organizations or Amnesty or Center for Human Rights in Iran, it's really important. It's true solidarity, and that's the most we can really do. There are people who want to see a regime change from outside. Many of us here understand that that didn't work so well in a place like Iraq and Libya. So we want to support the people of Iran in determining their own destiny. So thank you for your excellent work.
Thank you so much.
Now I need to invite my two friends back up here. We're going to have a few minutes for Q&A with you all before we got to make you a little hungrier for the meal.
I'm kind of stuck. Is that good? Okay. Is that good?
While you're doing that, I want to ask you, how can we help United for Iran?
Thank you so much for that. Obviously, donation is great. I can quickly say a few things that folks can do just in general to help the movement. I think like you mentioned, you joked, and we always make this joke. In 2009, the Michael Jackson died, and radio silence on Iran. So making sure we're staying informed on Iran, deeply informed on Iran, beyond the news cycle, I think is critical. And that kind of allows us to make better decisions as we want to provide support in other ways. So there are sanctions on Iran, and affects Iran through banks as well as through technology, and advocating in different ways to making sure that doesn't happen. So Iran stays open, I think is critical. There are a lot of efforts being done right now to keep Iran open. And Reza, whoever sits next to him during dinner, can talk to him about it. They're doing a lot of effort of keeping Iran open, Starlink and other ways. So I think supporting that, I think, is critical. I think sustained support. Even if it's $10, just continuing. I think we have a tendency to do one thing and then want to do the next thing, and they're all important. But whatever it is, keeping it so it can be counted upon, and it's having a relationship with that, whatever it is. And it can be us. I would love more donations, and it's so many different groups. If anyone's interested and they have a very specific thing, I will find you the right group to support if you're interested. And I think I'll say one more thing about support that I think is so important. This is one of my favorite quotes, and I wrote it down because I usually butcher it. If you have come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, let us work together. We saw what happened January 6th here, and we saw what happened after Lula got elected right in Brazil. Things either spiral down, or we saw the uprising in Iran by women, and the woman in Afghanistan did the uprising immediately shortly after, or things spiral up. What kind of world do we want to see? So the support we give is not, of course, we want to help each other in other countries. We're doing it because we want to create a world that's the way we want it, and that's why we're doing it.
And I'll just add that I have, in my lifetime, and I'm not super young, I've never heard a better slogan than Woman, Life, Freedom. And I think it's such an important slogan for us to understand in this country as well. Every time I talk about Iran, I, in the same breath, say our bodily autonomy. The rights of women are being undercut in this country at a dramatic pace. So when you do that work for a place like Iran, you're really doing it because you care about it here too. Okay, over to you now. Any questions? I believe there's some mics going around.
This may be an extremely naive question, but is there any sense that within the cleric community there are people who are dissenters to this? Do you know what I mean? Are they all so extreme?
Do you want to take that, Yegi?
Sure. There are good people and bad people everywhere, extremists or hardliners or more moderate. This time around, as Firuza was talking about, how everyone is out in the street and protested, and it's not limited to rich or poor or someone from the north or someone from the south, ethnic groups, religious minorities, including people within the system, including we have seen several clergymen came out and asked for more merciful approach by the supreme leader to the protesters, but also disapproving the way he and his household and IRGC are treating the people, including his own sister, and his own brother, and the supreme leader's niece, who has been just recently sentenced to 15 years in prison. So no. Yes, and there are several clergies who are based in Qom, which is a very religious city in Iran, where the seminaries are, who also announced their dissatisfaction of this way of treating people with so much harshness and the severe crackdown, especially on the youth. And it's interesting in a sense that the way regime is treating people, it even caused disturbance within the clergy society. And for the first time, they are voicing their anger and disapproval of this. And I talk to, all of us have like friends, relatives in the society, in the community in Iran. And I was talking to a friend whose father is a clergy and he comes from a religious background. And he was telling me that it's good to know that people are frustrated. Even someone like my family, within my own family, we believe this regime is like killing Islam for those who really are pious and traditional and really like to just practice their own religion. So even those believe that this regime is not helping them or doing justice to them.
Right over here.
So firstly, I just want to say that many of us have been blown away by the courage of the Iranian women and putting their lives on the line. I wish we could convey on behalf of many Americans our support for the Iranian women. My question is about the goal of the protests. I realize it's really about regime change, and I'm wondering, are there any cracks in the regime? Have you seen it being effective in any way? And are there any other goals of the protests?
There have been cracks. So Iran doesn't have tons of friends. They have Syria, they have Russia, China, Saudi Arabia a little bit now, which is complicated, not great. And they're starting to buy land in Venezuela. Yes. So they're hedging their bets a little bit. We're seeing certain cracks. And it's also the case of something looks really like, until it happens, it looks really strong, and all of a sudden it folds. So we're seeing that there are people defecting and what they're saying. And going to your question a bit, the government is kind of forcing the more junior folks, threatening their families to keep them in the streets. So there's that as well. And a lot of people were talking about transition, are also talking about, of course, we have to have transitional justice and think about all these things, and we have to make it so that the more junior folks know that they'll be okay and they won't be hurt if they defect. So that's kind of part of the conversation as well. Or others want to add?
You know, your question is probably the same question we all have. The goal of the protests at this moment is to resist a regime that is anti-woman and fundamentally corrupt. It's not a protest movement that we've ever seen before. Most revolutions are built around ideologies, either anti-imperialist, pro-Maoist, some pro-Khan thing. We're looking at something wholly different than we've ever seen. And I think that's one thing that makes us uncomfortable, is we want to slap a nice, easy ideological frame around it. And I think that is also, for me, one of the reasons why it is so incredibly inspiring, is that young people understand that this world is in big trouble environmentally, economically, politically, and it's in some ways, I think, more representative of a global moment than it is exclusively an Iranian moment. And I think that's where we have to sort of connect the dots for ourselves, that whatever is happening in Iran to women, it's happening right here. Yesterday I was on KQED and somebody said, do you think Islam and democracy are compatible? And I had to answer, I'm asking myself the same question about my own country. Is Christianity compatible with democracy? It doesn't look like it. So we have to fight both for Iran, but we also have to understand that we can be transformed by Iran by connecting the dots and understanding that it doesn't look like anything we've ever seen before, not in my life. And that's why I think that slogan, Women, Life, Freedom, is so incredibly important.
I wanted to just add, Persis June, one point about, sorry, I just wanted to add a point, and then please go ahead afterwards, about how you would like to support Iranian women. And I think one ask I have asked multiple times in the past 6 months is that it's up to all of us, as Percy said. We are now all American living under the flag of the United States, despite the backgrounds we have. And it's on all of us to come out and support. In DC, particularly where I live, in Washington, DC, there are weekly protests, okay? And I participated in my own capacity as an Iranian. But one thing that was interesting to me, that these protests, these rallies started every week right after Mahsa Amini was killed in Iran. But the only people attending these rallies are Iranians in diaspora. Where are our American neighbors? Where are our American friends? Where are African Americans? I participated in the Black Lives Matter protest in the streets of DC, despite my organization saying, you're a journalist, you should not go. I said, no, I'm going as a citizen, in my own capacity as a human, to support my other fellow American people. Doesn't matter if they're Black or Asian or Italian, so it's important. Talk to your neighbors, ask them to come and support. Every time there is a rally, we only see Iranian. As I said earlier, I say it with confidence, every piece of news that has been produced, at least in DC, and I got information on it, if somewhere in the back of the room, the news producer or some low level person was from an Iranian descent. So it's very important to the American community. As Firza said, maybe you donate $10, of course will make a difference. But also we have a saying in Farsi that one hand doesn't, if you clap, just one hand doesn't make enough noise. So we want the participation of our other fellow Americans from different race or religions or whatever to come and support us and talk about it and make sure that the story doesn't die out just because it is not in the TV or it's not in the news anymore, as Firza said. Doesn't mean that it's dead. It's not, but unfortunately doesn't get enough support from ordinary people.
Okay, there was a question over here.
I think this regime has one thing good. Nobody thinking about religion anymore. The people tired of religion.
Yes.
The people is very tired of this religion, and after this regime, the only good with this regime there is the people have not thinking about religion anymore. This is a very good point for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm getting the signal, so we have time for one more question.
Two more questions.
Actually, I have two. quick questions.
That's an Iranian right there. I have two
I am
questions.
not an Iranian. I'm a Palestinian who's really influenced by the regime in Iran, and I really have two important questions that I'm trying to contend with. The first one is where I can find a moral ground where I'm all for constraining the channels of money that's going to the regime in Gaza because of the way it's influenced, hugely putting the people of Gaza under terrible circumstances. But also that means in turn sanctioning the regime in Iran and also adding layers of economic pressure on the Iranian people. That's the first part of my question. The second part is about the news organizations and having been in Gaza and exposed a little bit to the nature of government entities trying to establish connections or personal relationships with journalists operating in the ground, and how the kind of dynamic or the self-censoring that will come naturally out of such communication between the government personnel, and what is the responsibility of the news organizations operating in such authoritarian environments? Because of clearly there is no free transfer of information from those environments. So, and by just continually operating in those environments, it makes it looks like things are fine, and our news rooms are operating in those environments. Thank you.
I'll take this first one. I'll let the journalist take the second one. Is that good? So Iran has a lot of sanctions. There's plenty of sanctions in Iran. I don't think we can put more sanctions. There are two types of sanctions. You have blanket sanctions, which is the one you're referring to. The targeted ones are on specific individuals, and everyone's fine with those. The blanket gets complicated because it does affect the people of Iran, but I think inside Iran, even to some extent, the view has changed, that kind of like short-term pain for long-term gain, kind of, so where people, they want them out, and some people are fine with that even, but it does have a lot of effects. Even I had to change the name of our organization in the States from United for Iran to U4I, because even transferring money to Canada was freezing for us. So all these things happen, but I don't think the West can put any more sanctions on Iran. They're doing everything they can. It's mostly the U.S., and then because other countries have to follow suit because they're either doing business with Iran or with the U.S., and we know which one they're going to pick. So that's where that situation is. And Iran has allies, obviously. Maybe this is a dinner conversation, in other countries that don't care about these issues. But I do think that issue of Palestine is really critical. It's I believe that we can't win alone, and we have to be intersectional, and we have to do it right by everyone. And it's very near and dear to my heart that we do it. And some of those outside are making alliances that are not going that way, and that's hard to see as well. Thanks for your question.
Okay. I need to defer to Joy.
How about we have two questions and then we go to dinner? And the whole idea of dinner is that we can explore these further. And
Okay.
the speakers are going to spread themselves out and enjoy conversation. So I think this young person was going to ask a question.
Hi. So I know that you were talking about how you want to have more people out and protesting and stuff like that. How do you think that you could utilize social media, or how have you utilized social media to gather the support of people like my age and around kind of my generation? Because I feel like that really promoted the Black Lives Matter movement that you were referencing and stuff like that. I think that a lot of that spread through social media specifically.
I would say that for younger people, I see lots of people who probably are not on Instagram. Sorry to be assuming that, but there are many organizations that are using social media both to amplify what's happening in Iran and also to promote events that are taking place here. The one that I go to is called Bay Area for Iran, because they have almost weekly protests or actions. Firuze, do you use social media?
We use social media. Also, there are a lot of acts of solidarity happening outside. Albany High School, right next to my house, did a walkathon and raised $3,000 for us. They made a little solidarity video that we pushed out. So if you see things happening in Iran, like that dance that you saw, that the last video, there's so many people. Once they those folks got arrested. Those girls got arrested, and so many people around the world, both inside and outside, started doing the same dance and sending the videos inside. So there are things like that, just responding and putting it on, and there are ways to push it out. If you send it to us, I'll make sure it gets pushed out.
And there are human rights organizations. Center for Human Rights in Iran uses social media both to report about what's happening in Iran and also to suggest actions that people can do. So those are two that I follow.
Yeah, I think Instagram, as you said, is a great tool because it's for now, it's the only accessible social media available to Iranians. For Facebook and Twitter, they have been blocked for a really long time, and people need to.
Oh, Instagram's not blocked?
Not completely. It is
Okay.
still accessible with VPN. So and Iranians happen to use it a lot, so you can see content and people organizing and assembling there, so you can I'm sure follow some of these accounts.
And speaking briefly of VPNs, you know, this is the ongoing struggle in Iran is how to keep those lines open, both within the country and going out, and et cetera. And I think it's kind of a cat and mouse game, is my understanding of it, is the innovators keep figuring out a new way to circumvent the government controls, and then, you know, the government catches up, and then there's the next phase of that. But worth noting, we have some very prominent Iranians in the tech community that are, you know, circulating not just, you know, how that technology is evolving, but things that everyday citizens outside of Iran can do to help.
We're going to have our last question.
Okay.
And then everyone will join, hopefully. I'm so glad the conversation was so inspired and come to dialogue, and we'll carry it on in the next room, okay? So please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for such an enriching conversation. What I'm going to ask you, it might probably leap into like a food, and you know, because it's not like a one-line answer. So, you know, you've talked about the sort of the challenge of lack of what's the word, like press or coverage that follows the, I would say, revolution. I think that we're at this point beyond the protest. So it is a very much a revolution that is taking in the most progressive ways, and as you mentioned, it has a horizontal sort of path. It's leaderless, and so we have that challenge that, you know, again, there is a very sort of a short insight that people, you know, from like the outside, like countries are covering. They're just looking for like this little like bite-sized like ways to like talk about this. Now, so one thing that for me is like very important to be amplifying the voices of Iran, and that is the most important thing that we can do in our diaspora. That said, some of the, as you've been following, some of the opposition leaders or influencers that are like in the diaspora, they are creating this sort of like this force that they want to, you know, focus on that sort of like a tokenness of like just like this just. They're misleading in a way. For example, in particular, like what just happened with Mahsa's Mansour, and sort of like these like 8 figures, like, you know, got into sort of a disagreement. And so, but then the ways in which that, again, like I find it is very misleading that these political figures are kind of, even though they're not saying, but their actions are showing that. So my question for you is like, what are some of the your methods or like the ways that you practice your own work to how are you like working into amplifying people's voices from Iran and in a way try to, you know, I don't know, like I just thought if there are any like ethics or tactics that are very important to you in regards to what's happening in our diaspora and how to kind of bring back attention to people of Iran.
I'll try to say something about that. I think, if I'm not mistaken, you might be referring to the people that have sort of stepped in to lead, and that includes Crown Prince Pahlavi, Reza Pahlavi?
Yes.
Yeah. My own personal feeling is you don't go back to something that you deposed, right? And I think there's a danger both among Iranians themselves in the diaspora and also a propensity for us to think like, oh, that was better than this, so let's go back to that. I think the goal should be to let the people of Iran lead the way. We know that governments in exile never are in touch with the pulse of the people. So myself, I have a sister who sends me, these videos, and I just told her outright, I do not support the turban, nor do I support the crown. And it's not really my choice in that regard. So I think one of the important things is to educate yourself, not about what was before as some kind of measure of what would be better, but rather, what do the people of Iran want? And, my feeling is that is what true solidarity is about listening and giving a voice to those who have the highest stakes in it, whether it's Iraqis, Palestinians, or Iranians. And I think that's part of the tension, I think, always is to think we know better than what people are doing there. And of course, we also want to project our version of democracy. And I don't think it works for everybody. It might work here, but it might not work in a place like Iran. Okay, I'm getting the... I have to say one more thing. Excuse me, just 1 second. So the food you're about to eat is made by a Bay Area chef named Hanif Sadr. He came in 2012. He was going to start engineering school, and he had a passion for northern Iranian cuisine. And instead, he followed his heart. He now has a restaurant in San Francisco called Comage.
You did the wrong thing.
So you're going to be eating from that. He's about ready to open a new physical space. It's somewhere over in the Mission. I don't know the address off the bat. So we hope you enjoy it. And Hanif's belief is that food is the greatest bridge between human beings, both in getting them to understand each other and to love each other. So I hope you love the food.
I just say that I want to say.
Oh.